History as it happens, February 3rd, 2022. 2 years of COVID.
China has more than 200 confirmed cases of coronavirus, it's called, which produces pneumonia-like symptoms. 3 people have already died from
Many
this
people
illness.
in the United States will at some point in time, either this year or next, be exposed to this virus.
For everyone else to put into practice the 15 days to slow the spread.
It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
Senator, we are here at a committee to look at a virus now that has killed almost 900,000 people.
What have we learned from the pandemic about the virus that continues to kill thousands each day across the globe, about the best ways to respond to an outbreak, and about ourselves as the unvaccinated fill intensive care units? Everyone is exhausted by the worst pandemic in a century, but we must learn from our mistakes. That's next when we speak to John Barry as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Now, South Africa was the first country to sound the alarm about the Omicron variant.
A number of new Omicron-fueled cases may have passed their peak, giving a glimmer of hope that the worst of the pandemic may be over.
They tell us to vaccinate ourselves endlessly and boost ourselves, even though that single strategy has failed, is failing, and will continue to fail. It must stop.
While they closed things down in 1918, and a few places did in 1919. Nobody closed anything in 1920. Just went on with your normal life. They were done with it.
In late February 2020, Dr. Nancy Messonnier held a CDC telebriefing. She warned us about what this new coronavirus might do to our lives. And man, did it sound alarming. But in retrospect, it should have been obvious, even if we really didn't want to accept it.
And I told my children that while I didn't think that they were at risk right now, we as a family need to be preparing for significant disruption of our lives. You should think about what you would do for childcare if schools or daycares close. Is teleworking an option for you? Secondary consequences of some of these measures might include missed work and loss of income. This whole situation may seem overwhelming, and that disruption to everyday life may be severe. But these are things that people need to start thinking about now.
And at that same time, and for weeks afterward, the President of the United States was delivering a much different message that future historians will make sure we never forget.
Now, the virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat, as the heat comes in. Typically, that will go away in April. When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
Well, here we are after 2 years of COVID, and close to 900,000 Americans have died, millions worldwide. And the pandemic is not over, even if some folks are declaring themselves to be over COVID. Just as many people did in 1920, actually, during the flu pandemic that killed something like 50 million people across the globe.
If you look back historically, everybody says, including me, that there were 3 waves of the 1918 pandemic. That's because everybody in 1919 said it's over. I'm done with it. I'm tired. It's gone. The reality is there was, in 1920, a wave that was quite deadly.
Historian John Barry is back to help us answer the question, what have we learned from this pandemic? We're also going to try to answer, when might it end? Although that one is probably impossible to answer at the moment. And I've been wrong about that one before. I thought when the vaccine became available in the U.S., we were finally on our way out. But as I speak into this microphone in early February, more than 2,000 Americans are dying every day, almost all of them unvaccinated. So there were 3 things I did not expect, but probably should have. Number 1, that parts of the globe would suffer from vaccine shortages. Number 2, in the U.S., a significant minority would oppose vaccination, even as the corpses kept piling up. And number 3, the virus would mutate into something the vaccine could not stop from infecting lots of people, even though the shots are still effective at preventing serious illness and death in most cases. Of course, I don't know anything about medicine, viruses, or infectious diseases, but John Barry does. And that is why he is back with us today. He is a distinguished scholar at the Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, and the author of The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. And he just wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, What Can We Learn from How the 1918 Pandemic Ended? John Barry, welcome back.
A pleasure to be back.
Well, it's been about a year since our first conversation, and now we're about 2 years since the first COVID death occurred in the United States. The death toll now about 875,000 Americans, and the pandemic is not over. Not here, not across the world. So before we take on what have we learned, let's talk about our current situation in Omicron. What might be next? Another variant, I'm assuming.
Well, there are going to continue to be variants. The only certain thing about them is that any future variant will be able to evade the immune system. Otherwise, it won't be able to exist. Its other characteristics are unknown, although I think there's a likelihood that it would be more mild, but there's no guarantee.
So this doesn't necessarily mean the next variant will be more deadly?
No, it does not.
Okay.
One of the things that's kind of interesting, Delta was very successful at spreading because it had this extraordinary viral load, orders of magnitude greater than prior variants. That viral load was in the upper respiratory tract, so it made it highly transmissible. Omicron does not have a viral load that's any bigger than Delta. It's still highly transmissible because it evades the immune system, not because of the viral load. Omicron also has considerably more difficulty infecting cells in the lung than Delta or the other variants that we've dealt with. There is, I think, some evolutionary pressure that will tend to push future variants away from the lung and toward the upper respiratory tract. Since you have some immune protection, it takes some time for the virus to infect the lung, and your immune system has a chance to mobilize. So to make an analogy, it's kind of like if a thief wants to break into a house and they see one house with a locked door and gates and so forth and so on, and you see another house with an open window, going to go into the open window. It's the path of least resistance. If your immune system is protecting the lung, it's harder for it to protect the upper respiratory tract. So there would be a tendency for the virus to go to the upper respiratory tract. That is not a guarantee. It is quite possible that you would get a variant that is good at infecting the lung and good at infecting the upper respiratory tract.
Let's hope not.
That would be a 1918 situation.
One of the World Health Organization's top officials, Maria Van Kerkhove, is warning people not to automatically believe theories. The virus will continue to mutate into milder strains that make you less sick. It sounds like you agree with her.
That would be the tendency, frankly, but there's no guarantee that that happens. There's no law of nature that says that.
So some people are, however, and when I say some people, medical professionals, not just charlatans on cable and television, are saying it might be time to shift from trying to avoid all or most infections to a strategy focusing on preventing serious illness and deaths. Do you agree with that? Is that even possible when so many people are still unvaccinated?
Well, the unvaccinated are, they're infected. And I think high numbers of them. So they would have considerable immune protection. I would tend toward agreement. Anybody who understood anything about the virus, even from the very beginning, I don't think that they ever believed this virus was going to go away. The virus at the very beginning looked pretty stable. Then we realized that the United States was not infected by the original virus from Wuhan. Turns out that the virus that was spreading in the United States and around the world was actually one from Europe. So that meant that the virus had improved its ability to infect people in Europe. So that's your first variant, you might say, or you would say.
I recall in New York, the governor at the time, Cuomo, saying that it was from Italy or something like that.
Yeah, and so once you know that it's not stable and it is mutating, then you know you're not going to get rid of it. At the same time, very early on, you knew it infected animals. And now we know it infects a lot of animals. So it's got an animal reservoir. even if you eliminated it from the human population, it would just jump back after some further mutation in an animal to come back to hit us again. No, so from very, very early, it was obvious that this thing was never going to go away. You know, there are a lot of good things coming down the pipe, primarily Paxlovid, the Pfizer pill. There's other therapeutic drugs in the works.
The monoclonal antibodies don't work on Omicron, is that right?
Well, one of them does.
One does.
And
okay.
You can also develop new monoclonals, hopefully polyclonals, some that would aim at multiple parts of the virus. That wasn't phrased properly, but you get the idea.
Yes.
Just like when you have vaccine against influenza, it's called a multivalent vaccine. You're generally vaccinated against several influenza viruses. So eventually we will get a vaccine that is either multivalent coronaviruses or even better, a single vaccine that'll work against all coronaviruses.
And hopefully people will be willing to get it, right? That's the other issue.
Well,
you know, what's confusing for me, who is fairly scientifically illiterate and has no medical background whatsoever, when it comes to strategies at this point in the pandemic, I look at, for instance, Denmark, on the one hand, is dropping all of their restrictions. They have a highly vaccinated public and only a couple dozen people, as I speak into this microphone right now, who are in their intensive care units. So they do not have a really, really serious problem. On the other hand, China is still trying to do COVID zero. As an authoritarian police state, they're able to basically turn large cities into open-air prisons. And then somewhere in the middle of the United States, where depending on where you live, could be a free-for-all, or say in New York City, where you have to show proof of vaccination to even go into a restaurant. So I'm not sure what the right approach is right now.
Well, China's going to run into a lot of problems. I don't believe that it's going to be capable of containing Omicron. Not only is the Omicron itself very transmissible, the vaccines that the Chinese produce, maybe they protect you against severe disease and death, but they have essentially no impact, I don't think, on the spread of Omicron. They're either going to fail dismally at their zero policy, or they're going to have to shut down so much of the country, like whack-a-mole. It's going to severely disrupt their economy and our supply chains.
There was an essay in The Atlantic by Kurt Anderson the other day headlined, "The Anti-Vaccine Right," speaking of the far right in the United States, "literally brought human sacrifice to America. His point is there is no ethically justifiable purpose for trying to persuade people not to get a vaccine." And he doesn't mean human sacrifice as a figure of speech. He means deliberately committing suicide to make a political point. As we start to look back at the last 2 years here, John, can you explain the fact so many people still refuse to seek vaccination when pretty much everyone dying from COVID right now is unvaccinated? I think the number is 95% or more unvaccinated?
Well, it depends on your source of information. People are locked into places that don't tell the truth, and yet they trust them. There are certainly hundreds of thousands of Americans who are dead who should be alive. We've mishandled this pandemic terribly. That's crystal clear. The death toll as we sit here in Australia is under 3,000. If you adjust for population, that would be about 36,000 in the United States.
Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, they have really large audiences and they have been pushing anti-vaccine propaganda. But I often wonder, I guess it's impossible to know for sure, how many people actually listen to them and don't receive a vaccination because of something they heard them or one of their guests say. I mean, I assume there have to be at least a few people who have. You have any thoughts on Joe Rogan and the controversy about him?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think, Rogan may at least, I don't listen to him, but from what I know, I think he may at least be sincere. Carlson, I think, is entirely untrustworthy. I think he knows better.
Well, there are doctors out there. This Dr. Robert Malone, I believe his name.
Right.
So, they are PhDs. They've done research in this area.
Malone's a legitimate scientist. He's got a real background. There's no question. But look at the data. Look at the numbers of people in ICUs who are vaccinated and look at the numbers of people who are in ICUs who are unvaccinated. That should be compelling. You look at the number of people who have died as a side effect. It's, when worldwide billions of doses, and the number of people with fatal side effects is so tiny, so infinitesimal.
About the vaccine.
The risk of the vaccine, is there no risk? There's some risk, yeah, sure. But the risk of the disease is so many light years greater. Not to mention, forget about dying, long COVID, which we still don't know much about. And in fact, people who are not severely ill, and in some cases even asymptomatic, they still suffer from long COVID. We don't know where that's going.
And there's also the disruption to life if you do come down with a virus. I mean, I have a vacation, not to digress about this. I have a vacation coming up, and I don't want to get sick prior to, because for ethical reasons, it would be wrong for me to board an airplane if I'm COVID positive. I wouldn't be able to come to work for several days, and that would disrupt things. I would have to cancel interviews, etc. So there's that instead. This isn't just the cold where you stay home for a day or two. There's societal rules.
It's also one of the areas that I don't believe we've done a very good job of supporting people who should be isolating because they've been exposed or are infected.
So 2 years of COVID, we'll go back to the beginning now. Thank you for entertaining those questions about the current situation. 2 years ago, really more than that, the outbreak in China was late 2019. Yet we still don't know for sure what happened, where it came from, or do we? Does it even matter anymore?
I don't think it really ever mattered. Even people who think it might be a lab leak don't believe it was a bioweapon. Even those who think lab leak think it was an accident. That may have some impact in terms of liability, and it may have consequences in terms of worldwide diplomacy, probably would. But in terms of handling the disease, no. It's out there and we need to deal with it. And we should have dealt with it better than we have.
So as to what we learned 2 years in, I'll offer some assertions one by one and I'll let you pick them apart because, like Joe Rogan, I don't know what I'm talking about. It seems to me that one thing we learned was after the initial outbreak in China and the failure to contain it there, maybe this is hindsight speaking, that this proved really impossible to contain. And if there was ever a strategy for containment here or elsewhere, it was misbegotten from the start. This just wasn't going to happen. It spread too quickly without us really realizing it. Do you agree?
I agree with that. I do know some public health people or know of who think that it could have been contained in the United States. I think it was already too widespread when we first became aware of it. I don't think here in the United States we could have done what Australia did. They're incredibly successful, obviously, but we certainly could have done a lot better.
Or controlled, maybe. That's possible. That might have been possible. And I think some parts of the country tried harder than others. I do think back to the 15 days to slow the spread and wonder what in God's name was going on. But the fact is, parts of the country did shut down for a little while. Not entirely like in some other countries where people weren't even allowed to leave their homes, except for some fresh air. But businesses closed in the United States, schools closed. Was that the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think so. I probably wouldn't have done it the same, simultaneously around the country. I think I would have probably waited for it to appear in a community before I had that community shut down. Remember, we knew nothing about the disease really at that point. You saw what was happening in Italy, in Spain, in New York City. If we made no effort to control it, it would have happened everywhere in the United States. And it didn't. So that step, I think, obviously came late in New York City. As I said a moment ago, and I know there are people who disagree with me on this, but I think it would have been better if it had happened community by community. For one thing, part of the problem, which we're still dealing with, I think, is that people suffered through those closures when there was no virus in their vicinity. And it led them to thinking that this was not a big deal. Why were these controls imposed on them? So it triggered resentment and resistance at the very beginning. And if You'd waited a little bit till they had reason to recognize that this was real. It was in their community. Then I think some of the problems that we're dealing with now might never have surfaced.
The idea of closures was to give hospitals, it wasn't to snuff out the disease, right? It was to give the healthcare system a chance
flatten the curve. So the healthcare system would not be overwhelmed.
And that worked in many places. Obviously worked in New York City.
I think that worked pretty much everywhere. It's a very difficult opponent. And as we discovered, the variants kept changing. Another problem we had, well, first, in terms of lessons, before this pandemic ever started, I thought there were two lessons that came out of the 1918 pandemic. Number one, tell the truth. When all you have is public health measures, nobody's going to comply with them if they don't believe you and trust you. That's central. Number two, that non-pharmaceutical interventions, the social distancing and so forth, they work. They mitigate disease, they save lives. They work better in this pandemic than the strongest advocates ever imagined. And again, going back to Australia and South Korea and so forth.
Japan.
But there are other ways of handling it.
Something I learned recently from reading an op-ed by Dr. Hitoshi Oshitani. He is a professor of virology in Japan, and he's helped the Japanese government on its COVID response. Apparently in Japan, government shutdowns are illegal. But what they did there was tell people to avoid the 3 C's, and the population cooperated. And those 3 C's are avoid closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact settings.
Right.
And it's worked for them. Whereas here in the U.S., after the first wave of shutdowns, if you will, some people let their guards down, and we saw a large spike in the summer and then again in the first winter. And now we're going through it again. I guess it's hard to expect people to avoid these settings, but, I mean, what choice do you have? If you expose yourself, you could wind up dead, which has happened. I don't want to be an alarmist, but it's happened.
Yeah, in the U.S., it's chaos. Japan also did something different with contact tracing, recognizing early that there were clusters and that there were super spreaders. Instead of going forward with their contact tracing, they actually went backwards to try to identify who super spreaders were and then trace backwards to see how many people were at the same place and isolate, build out from that so that they weren't wasting a lot of energy. We never got contact tracing right.
We got swamped.
We never had adequate personnel, never had adequate support for the people who were contacted. Just so many things that we didn't do.
The testing got botched right from the beginning. How do you evaluate the performance of the FDA and the CDC as we look back at the last 2 years? Let's go FDA first. They messed up the testing issue early on, and we never recovered.
I agree with you. So enough said.
CDC, how does the CDC perform? People don't trust it anymore.
I know a lot of people at the CDC. Pretty much everyone I know I have very high regard for. Part of it is, particularly at the beginning, in the first few months, was political. Part of it was, I think, a slowness in recognizing that this was different from SARS-1. You got to proceed from a worst case scenario. I don't think they accepted the worst case scenario. It's actually not the worst case scenario. The virus could be a lot more lethal than it is. But in terms of spread, it's worst case scenario. The whole U.S. government was late to the game. And of course, CDC screwed up the test. We were flying blind, and we still haven't got testing right 2 years later. Probably the most serious blow that came out of the government, permanent government scientists, was not getting the testing right. Obviously, in the Trump administration, there was a lot of political interference, and the messaging was screwed up because the president of the United States was undermining his own scientists. That contributed enormously to the politicization. Liberate Michigan.
If I live to 100, I will never forget the day I was sitting in the newsroom watching a news conference where the president turned toward Deborah Birx and asked her whether we could pump people full of ultraviolet light and disinfectant liquids.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light.
How do you rate Dr. Anthony Fauci, his performance over the past 2 years?
Well, he's been in an incredibly difficult spot. I'd still give him an A. I may be biased. He's certainly not a close friend. I know him and have known him for a while. You know, he is a very close friend of some of my closest friends. But if you look at the position that he was in, I think, you know, first, he was the only one who was telling the truth as he knew it for months. The idea that he's become a target, it's just a sign of almost a breakdown of American society. You know, the suggestion that he's doing something to benefit financially is so bizarre.
He's been criticized for telling a white lie, I guess you would put it, about the masks.
This time 2 years ago, I was saying don't wear masks. There's data supporting that, you know, that I was familiar with from the 1918 pandemic and from other studies that were all inconsistent. They knew in 1918, they knew for a scientific fact that if you put a mask on somebody sick, that protected people around them. But wearing it for the general public is an entirely different proposition. So aside from the issue of trying to save the N95 supply for healthcare workers, which is a factor in what they were saying, but it wasn't the only factor. That's the white lie that you're referring to, I would guess.
Yes.
But the evidence was not great. The evidence changed. Plus the recognition there is asymptomatic spread in influenza. Over 30% of it spreads asymptomatically. That's half of what it is with COVID-19. The difference in the rates of asymptomatic spread, that's an important factor. They didn't recognize that at the beginning, and that I think they knew that there was asymptomatic spread, as I said, in influenza, 30% asymptomatic, but not the extent. The other thing is how long you shed virus. That's also a factor. And you shed virus for a much longer time with COVID-19 than you do with influenza. So that also affects whether or not masks are effective or not. There's a lot more to that than simply trying to protect the supply for healthcare workers, I think, or at least there was when people asked me, and I was saying, no, I wouldn't wear a mask in the general public. I had a lot of things going on when I said that, and I reversed myself because I learned more. That's what happens.
Yeah, that's the definition of science.
Yeah.
Well, I admire Dr. Fauci. I don't understand the hatred that he receives. I think we have to be fair. There are mistakes. Many mistakes have been made. Which ones were avoidable? Which ones should the experts who we trust, which ones should they have avoided versus the ones that were unavoidable, dealing with a novel virus, right?
Things that were avoidable, obviously. We already talked about deaths. The communication breakdown. What can you say about it? The undercutting of appropriate messaging, which led to 875,000 dead Americans. You know, the Biden administration has made some errors, but they've been trying to do the right thing.
They've been pushing vaccination.
But they, did make a mistake on not expanding the testing capacity. In fact, that's one area where Fauci has said from the beginning he wanted to flood the country with tests. It's not clear why the administration really made the call not to do that. They committed to it now, actually back in October, but they could have committed to it earlier. People stepping on each other's message, that should have been avoided. That's an unforced error. This administration should have coordinated more on messaging. What you tell people is so central to the results that you're going to get, the amount of compliance with your advice. It's got to be crystal clear, and it needs to be framed. It should have been framed differently. It should have, at the very beginning, it should have been framed in the context. Expect this to change as we learn more. We don't know everything. We're giving you the best advice based on what we know now, but good chance we'll shift the advice when we know more. If you create that expectation and understanding, then people are more accepting when you do change your advice. Obviously in July, when President Biden suggested that we were on the verge of independence from the virus, clearly that was a messaging mistake.
Hard to win back credibility after you've lost it.
Yeah, exactly.
I also believe that no matter what experts say, there's going to be a portion of the American population that's not going to believe anything. And my concern for the next one, because we know there's going to be another pandemic, is Organizations like the CDC, FDA, etc., their credibility has taken a real hit here, and that could cause more problems, whether it's fair or unfair.
It's very fair. Hopefully, the next pandemic won't show up next year. So maybe by then, CDC will recover.
Have you read Albert Camus' The Plague?
I did, but a long time ago.
My next
What
question.
I remember most from that was the guy who was trying to write a novel. Never got past the first page.
I read it early on in the pandemic because on the subject of what have we learned, I think we've learned something about human beings and human nature that is disturbing, but maybe it shouldn't have been all that surprising. You know, the people of Camus' Oran, the fictitious city of Oran, refused to believe something like a plague was possible, even though there have always been plagues. I guess we can say the same of many Americans. I didn't expect that so many of my fellow citizens, who are otherwise sane people, not just talking about wackos, would practice sustained denialism, even up to now, with thousands of people dying because they did not seek out a vaccination. What do you think historians, as a historian yourself, are going to say about this period in America?
Well, I think they'll look at it with amazement. And they look at other countries, not just Australia, that have done a much better job. Canada has done a much better job. Germany has done a much better job, much better than the United States. And I've been picking those countries as opposed to South Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam, because culturally they're so close to the United States. In 1918, there was no partisanship. There were plenty of lies, but there was no partisanship. In 1918, what you had was sort of a chaos. Nobody knew what to believe. That spread fear much more than today. But here you're different. You have two entirely separate sets of beliefs, practically. You've got the significant majority of the people who take it seriously. And then you've got a minority, but not a tiny minority, who believe something entirely different. Anti-mask, anti-vax, it's all tied up in identity. Somehow it got tied up into their identities as part of the entire way they view the world. The pandemic could have been a unifier and should have been, but it wasn't. I mean, look at Merkel in Germany, for example. Her poll numbers were higher than her entire, I mean, she was there almost forever, it seems. And she had never seen approval ratings such as she saw in the pandemic. People the only time in Trump's presidency his approval cracked 50% was right after he said we were at war with the virus. He could have unified the country around fighting the virus, but he didn't. And, once he started undermining those, people like Liberate Michigan, and I don't want to wear a mask. Yeah, you can wear a mask if you want, but I'm not going to wear a mask.
He accused doctors and nurses of sneaking excess equipment out the back door to sell it to make money as an explanation as to why there were equipment shortages.
Yeah.
The United States, in a way, was fertile ground for these type of fanatical ideas, and it just took a pandemic to bring them all the way out into the open. I mean, I did not think, despite all of our political divisions, where everything became political, right versus left, I thought the pandemic, like you, would unify people, but it did not. I don't know what that says about the bonds of our republic, but...
Well, I think it's because politicians on the right, not all of them, used it as a wedge. I can remember years ago when I was a political reporter writing about Congress, and my first book was about the Congress. And first time I ever had lunch with a congressman was with Newt Gingrich. And he was a low backbencher, ignored by his own party. Nobody took him seriously. And I remember he pulled out a napkin at lunch and drew a triangle and said, we have these wedge issues and we're going to define the Democratic Party outside the triangle. And they proceeded to, the Republican Party very effectively used wedge issues, cultural issues, and most recently critical race theory, to try to make the Democratic Party seem out of the mainstream. And they used the pandemic to fit into this wedging apart of the American public. it's killing their own voters. It'd be very interesting whether there's some really close election that a few hundred more Republicans might have won, but they're dead and don't vote.
I remember you telling me about the 1918 pandemic and how public health authorities, such as they were in those days, telling people, don't worry, this is nothing really serious, but people not believing it because they could see with their own eyes the corpses piling up, literally speaking. Today, the data is in black and white for anyone who wants to find it. The number of people who are unvaccinated dying each week in the United States, and yet there's still denialism. I can't penetrate that mentality. My final point, and I'll let you have the final word. Maybe there is nothing else to say.
Yeah.
Last time I spoke to you, I asked you a dumb question about, how are we going to know when this is over? And you politely answered, well, we'll know when people stop dying. Do we see signs Omicron is peaking and there's a chance that in a few months this could be endemic and not a pandemic?
Yeah, there's very much a chance, but it could go the other way. If you look back historically, everybody says, including me, that there were 3 waves of the 1918 pandemic. The reality is that's because everybody in 1919 said it's over. I'm done with it. I'm tired. It's gone. The reality is there was in 1920 a wave that was quite deadly. And in some cities, Detroit, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, some other places, it was actually the deadliest few weeks of an entire 2-year period.
Wow.
But nobody talks about the 4th wave because they were over it in 1919. They just didn't want to hear about it anymore. And while they closed things down in 1918, and a few places did in 1919, nobody closed anything in 1920. Just went on with your normal life. They were done with it. So they were weary just as we are weary. I think there's a good chance that, and maybe I think a likelihood, that this virus will continue to mutate in the direction that Omicron mutated, that is toward the upper respiratory tract and not infecting the lung. There is a theory, which I'm not necessarily an adherent of, but it's plausible. It's interesting. The so-called 1889 influenza pandemic, which lasted 3 or 4 years, was actually caused by a coronavirus called OC43, which today causes a common cold. So this may have happened before. If, in fact, OC43 caused the 1889 pandemic, then it became a common cold virus. That could happen, SARS-CoV-2. Obviously, we hope it does. But again, there's no guarantee. And even if it ends up there, which I think is a reasonable possibility, you don't know how long it's going to take to get there. So again, in 1920, you had a pretty nasty wave, even though historians don't generally even refer to it.
Wow. And of course, there are large swaths of the globe, sub-Saharan Africa, where there's been almost no vaccine, really, right? Very low rates of vaccination. So this is still a global issue, not just a U.S. issue. There was on Twitter the other day, for what it's worth, trending, I'm over COVID. And I made a joke to one of my friends about that. I said, well, I'm over inflation. I know that inflation's real, but when I go to the grocery store and the clerk says, $30, please, I'm only going to hand him $20 because I simply refuse to believe the price of groceries is going up. If I get arrested and thrown in jail for shoplifting, I'll still deny it. Before I speak to you next, you can read Camus again, and I'll try to read something scientific so we can connect.
Okay.
John Barry, we thank you once more for helping us make sense of this mind-boggling situation. On the next episode of History as It Happens, nowadays, lots of smart people are writing articles and essays and letters trying to explain what is wrong with us, why we seem to be falling apart at the seams, why the bonds of our republic are fraying. Maybe the generation gap can help explain it. That's next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.